I knew a lot of the guys that came out of the blues were rural farm workers, and in order to get out of the situation they were in, they picked up a guitar some kind of way, and started trying to learn how to play guitar, and they never had any really great formal training, very little education, and they started doing the blues and the joints at night after they had been working in the fields all day, and they would come into these joints down in Greenwood, Mississippi, and you name it, Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas. Howlin' Wolf was from Arkansas.
These guys didn't have any idea what they were doing. They were just making up their own chords on broken guitars that were mostly out of tune. Keith Richards talks a lot now about using different tunings throughout his career. It's because he was emulating these guys who didn't even know how to tune a guitar. So he's got to come up with all these weird, funky ways to make his guitar have rock and roll sounds.
The blues music itself begat other forms of music. It gave birth to the little Stevie Wonders and all these other people, which went off in all these directions. You had people like Ray Charles, who not only played blues, but could play jazz and country and gospel, and did so, at a whim.
Led Zeppelin, who a lot of people would consider one of the greatest rock and roll bands of all time, they lifted so many of their riffs and themes musically, lyrically even, off of the Bluesmen. When you want to talk about the Beatles and the Stones being the two first big rock bands, they were the first ones to start doing things experimentally. You'd have to say Dylan before them was kind of the first rock star, first kind of guy who started singing about something as opposed to just rock around the clock tonight and Jailhouse Rock and that kind of bullshit. You look back, nobody could do what they do today without the Beatles kind of starting the blueprint. But the Beatles, if you listen to the Beatles now, it's almost like show tunes. Like, it's just so campy and goofy. But they really kind of knocked down a bunch of doors for the Stones to show up and just be these rock and roll outlaw guys. Like Keith Richards always had cigarettes dangling from his lips. The guy was always about to pass out. I mean, those guys didn't give a fuck. They were the first really band to come through and be like, we're fucking rock and roll band. You don't like it, fuck you. These guys are dangerous, and that whole element of danger they concocted themselves and turned it into a positive for them.
Gonna happen next. Sometimes things just don't want to go my way. Sometimes things just don't want.
Of course, the Beatles were the guys, but the Rolling Stones came here because they liked the chest sound. They were impressed with Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley and Willie Dixon. Of course, they got their name from a song that Willie Dixon had called "I'm a Rolling Stone" that he used. I think it was with Muddy. When they came here in '63, they were able to record their first hit single in the studio upstairs. And then they came back and recorded another hit single in the studio upstairs in 1964.
And they did it while being deeply rooted in the blues. The Beatles songs weren't really deeply rooted in the blues, but the Stones were like, yo, this is what the black guys do, this is what we're gonna do, we're all about rock and fucking roll. They just threw all the conventions out the window and it worked in their favor.
They made a big contribution. They made the world more aware of the blues and the original people that created it. That was their contribution. And because of that, a lot of the old blues guys became better known, and a lot of them made a lot of money.
Now that having worked with the Rolling Stones, I worked with them in 1982, and I toured Europe with them in 1982. And sitting down at night talking to Keith and Mick and Ron Wood, mostly Ron Wood and Keith. And they had a good lock on American blues history. They really studied it, because when they came to Chicago in the 60s, they used to go over to Muddy Waters' house, who lived over in a place called Lake Park Avenue at a home. They'd sit on the front porch over there and be in his house and whatnot. Buddy Guy had a club called what is that? I can't think of it, but at any rate, they got to be a friend of Buddy's, you know, really well.
The old location was just down the street on the next corner, and that was there for 21 years. First weekend we were open was Blues Fest, and then immediately after was Crossroads, and we had Jeff Beck in here. We had Ron Wood from the Rolling Stones in here. B.B. King within the past few weeks has been in here. George Benson, Buddy got up on stage with them. So even for the short time that this location's been open, it's got a lot of history going on in here. But one thing you have to realize that when you look around this room and you see all these guitars on the wall, you know, of all these, especially the rock guys, you have to realize that they took from Buddy, okay? You know, influence, stole, whatever you want to use, but and you have to realize that those guys were fans of Buddy, and him and other guys were around first before they were, so you would have to say that blues influenced rock.
Where did you go when I was down?
Kingston Mines started out as a cafe and general store, coffee house back around beginning of 68, late 1967 as an offshoot of what was the Kingston Mines Theater Company. And Kingston Mines was known for such plays as Grease and Catch-22, where they had their first runs at, and to this day they still come back here to celebrate. It was sort of a place where you could go after the play and hang out and see folk musicians and whatnot, and they would play and put their hat out on the stage. And there was no liquor license back then, so we served tea and coffee, and we had a restaurant that bordered on being vegetarian, and a lot of good food and a lot of good times. Sort of an enclave of intellectuals who had a penchant for good music, and the music was always eclectic. I've had so many good memories in this place that I can't pick one over another to be a great memory. Getting to have the Rolling Stones show up and sit in on one of my shows. David Bowie, the Grateful Dead were always around back in the day. They're all good memories. The people who I've seen just walk in the door and incidentally play. Dan Aykroyd walked in one night and just walked up on stage with Eddie Clearwater and did a duet of Sweet Home Chicago for almost 20 minutes. But everybody in the audience was so engrossed by what was going on, the spontaneity of it all. And that's really what we've always stood for, is keeping the music alive and well and keeping the spontaneity of what was going on, much like it was back in the day.
The younger black people are more into hip hop and rap, and they're not into blues that much. The blues is being carried on by mostly a white audience in America. I play with a band currently called the Chicago Rhythm and Blues Kings, and I'm the only black guy in the band. As a black man in the music field in America, we feel that we lost out tremendously on the fame and the financial end of it, because we never did get a fair shake from the media. We couldn't get on the airways like we should have been on the airways. We couldn't get the airplay from And if you listen to the radio right now in America, there's very few stations playing the blues. There are very few stations playing the blues.
I want to say it was Mud Morganfield that told me this story about how his dad was driving along one winter morning and he saw a guy walking down the street and not dressed for the weather, obviously just got off the bus from the south someplace, walking down the street with a guitar over his shoulder. And he'd pull over and he'd get the kid into the car and take him over to Gladys's over on 47 and get him something to eat. And then he'd try to find him a gig someplace, a place to stay. But that's because musicians help musicians. That's the reason why this music is so long-standing and well-loved.